Hi everyone, it's Helen Hortai here, founder of FormHelp, and we are on the australia.gov.au/states website. Now I've done some guides on how to complete the Australia DPD or Digital Passenger Declaration, and I'm finding that lots of people are asking whether I know what the entry requirements are for each of the different states and territories. So I decided I needed to address the entry requirements for each of the states and territories. Now, before I begin, I have a couple of requests. Now, I have a goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of 2022. So if you can help out, that would be greatly appreciated. And if you find this video helpful, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up. Thanks, everyone. Okay, now let's get into seeing what the entry requirements are for Northern Territory. Okay, we are on the Northern Territory government page. Now, as you can see here, it says international arrivals. International travellers must follow the pre-arrival advice on the Smart Traveller website. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Okay, so this was updated on the 2nd of March 2022. So it looks like if you meet the DPD requirements, then you're all good to travel to the Northern Territory. However, pre-arrival, let's look at the pre-arrival advice. So I did ring the National Advice Hotline on 1800 020 080 because I just wanted to confirm if there was any pre-entry requirements to get into the Northern Territory if you're flying from overseas. And the person that I spoke to confirmed that there is no prerequisites to get into the Northern Territory. He just said, as long as you'd done your DPD, then that was good enough for you to get into the Northern Territory. So cool. Now, as you can see here under international arrivals, there's the 3 dots there. Let's press on there. And then you can see here that there is mandatory supervised quarantine and fees. Then we also have quarantine facilities. I think I will just cover the mandatory supervised quarantine and fees and the quarantine facilities. And maybe we'll also look at the current restrictions. Okay, let's go ahead. Now, it says mandatory supervised quarantine and fees. So there are 2 mandatory supervised quarantine facilities in the Northern Territory. So you have the Centre for National Resilience in Howard Springs, Darwin, and also Alice Springs Quarantine Facility, Alice Springs. So you will be required to undertake 14 days mandatory supervised quarantine if you are a repatriated Australian or you have been directed to quarantine by the Chief Health Officer. So there's information there. So click on those links as you need. So you are not required to pay to undertake mandatory supervised quarantine if you are a COVID-19 positive or a close contact unless you were already required to undertake 14 days border arrival quarantine. So in this instance, you will be charged for the border arrival quarantine. Now you are required to quarantine at the facility closest to your entry into the Northern Territory unless otherwise directed by the Chief Health Officer or their delegate. Now, prior to arriving into the Territory, if you have any queries regarding mandatory supervised quarantine fees, you can call this number here, 1800 490 484. Quarantine fee. So the quarantine fee for 7 days of quarantine for an individual is $1,225 for unvaccinated border arrivals, and a family rate of $2,450 applies for family groups of 2 or more people travelling and arriving at quarantine together. Now this fee is applied for all in the family group regardless of vaccination status, i.e. if one person is the quarantining family group is unvaccinated, then the full family fee will be applied. Now, people in mandatory supervised quarantine will also be subject to testing before exiting quarantine. Now, if you refuse a test, there will be 7 days added to your quarantine time. And if you are required to undertake an additional 7 days of quarantine, a further fee will be charged at $175 per night for an individual or $350 per night for families. Now, if you are an Australian resident on a low income, an Australian resident is a person who lives in Australia on a permanent basis and is one of the following. So, an Australian citizen or the holder of a permanent visa. Now, Australian residents with a low income may be eligible for a 50% reduction of their quarantine fee. Now, the low income threshold requirements are for singles, $52,706, and for families, $68,894. Now, low income earners will be required to provide their most recent Australian Tax Office tax assessments notice or a statement from Centrelink. Repatriation travellers. Now, documents showing your residency status and low income must be submitted to Quarantine Assistance at health.gov.au within 14 days after completing quarantine. Otherwise, an invoice will be sent for the full amount, and an invoice will be generated and sent to you for payment. Non-repatriation travellers. Now, contact details to submit a request will be available with your invoice, and your application for the low income reduction will need to be submitted within 14 days of the invoice date. And if your application for low income status is approved, the invoice amount will be reduced and a revised invoice will be sent to you. And if your application for low income status is not approved, you will be notified of the outcome and you are still required to pay the full quarantine fee. When and how to pay the fee. Now, if you are required to complete mandatory supervised quarantine, you will receive an invoice for your quarantine fee, which will include details of how to pay, and the fee will be due 30 days from the invoice date. Now, payments can be made online, by credit card, or over the phone or in person at a receiver of Territory Monies. Now, you can find these details on the invoice. Now, you won't need to pay when you check in at your quarantine accommodation. Payments plan for Territory residents. If you are unable to pay the full amount of the invoice in one transaction, you will be able to set up a payment plan, and you will need to call the number on the invoice to discuss and arrange payments options. And low income earners are also able to use payment plan options. FAQs, or frequently asked questions. Now, who can I contact if I have a query about mandatory supervised quarantine fees? Now, you can call this number here, 1-800-490-484. Who can I contact if I have a question once I receive my invoice? So you can contact the DCDD Accounts Receivable team on this link here. Can I have my quarantine fee reduced? Now, if you are a low-income earner and a Territory resident, you may be eligible for a reduced quarantine fee of $1,250 per person or $2,500 per family, or 2 or more people sharing accommodation. Now, the low-income threshold requirements are for singles $52,706 and for families $68,894. Now, low-income earners will be required to provide their most recent ATO notice of assessment or a current Centrelink statement, and your application for the low income reduction should be submitted within 14 days of the invoice date to the following email address. So just click on that link there, or you can click here. Will I be charged additional quarantine fees if I refuse a test? Now, if you have refused a test, there will be a 7 days added to your quarantine time, and the additional fee is $1,750 for an individual or $3,500 for families. What can I do if I have problems paying my invoice? Now, if you are an Australian resident and you are unable to pay the full amount of the invoice in one transaction, you will be able to set up a payments plan, and you will need to call the number on the invoice to discuss and arrange payment options. What do I do if I have not received my invoice? Now, under Section 52A of the Public and Environmental Health Act 2011, the Chief Health Officer has the power to charge a fee to a person who enters the Territory for quarantine purposes. And if you have not received an invoice, then contact the DCDD Accounts Receivable team at this link here. Can I have my invoice redirected to my employer? Yes, your employer will need to contact Debt Management on this link here to arrange the invoice to be redirected to them. How can I pay my invoice? Now, payment options will be detailed in your invoice. Will I be charged the full amount if I am eligible to leave mandatory quarantine before the full 14 days? No, you will only be charged at the daily rate of $175 for individuals and $350 for family groups for the time spent in supervised mandatory quarantine. What constitutes a family? So this means 2 or more individuals in a family relationship. An infant under the age of 2 is not an individual. Therefore, if an infant is travelling with a single individual, the quarantine fee for an individual is $2,500 for the full 14-day period. What if I am a patient-assisted travel, PATS, patient returning to the Northern Territory? So PATS patients, including escorts, are required to complete 14 days of mandatory supervised quarantine upon return from a hotspot will not be charged. Do I need to pay if I am required to go into mandatory supervised quarantine due to being in close contact with an identified case of COVID-19? So in this instance, individuals will not be charged for their quarantine period if they are directed to quarantine at government-arranged accommodation. Do minors need to be accompanied by an adult? Minors, people under 18 years, are not permitted to stay at the facility without a parent or responsible adult to supervise. However, if an adult needs to stay with a minor for the purpose of supervision, the fee will only be charged at the individual rate for the minor who is legally required to quarantine, not the supervising adult. Now, for assistance, you can call this 1-800-490-484 number between the hours of 8 a.m. to 5 p.m, Mondays to Saturdays. And as you can see here, this was last updated on the 3rd of March 2022. Okay, so we've looked at the mandatory supervised quarantine and fees. Let's have a look at the quarantine facilities. So for the quarantine facilities, we have read that section there about the 2 different mandatory supervised quarantine facilities. So the one in Darwin and the one in Alice Springs. So face masks, physical distancing and room. So the Chief Health Officer Direction 52 of 2021, with the link there, sets out what a person must do when in quarantine at the Centre for National Resilience and at Alice Springs Quarantine Facility. Now, this direction is law, meaning every person in quarantine must do what the direction says. Now, if a person does not follow the direction, the Northern Territory Police may issue an infringement notice with a financial penalty. So the direction works to prevent transmission of COVID-19 between residents in quarantine, thereby keeping all residents or staff and our community safe. So if COVID-19 is spread between residents because people did not follow the direction, affected residents will be required to remain in quarantine beyond 14 days. A person in quarantine must stay in the person's allocated room, including on any veranda space allocated to the room, unless permitted by an authorised officer, and when not in their room or on their veranda, residents must take all reasonable measures to stay at least 1.5 metres away from any other person in the quarantine facility, except for the person's spouse, de facto partner, child or parent, and wear a face mask when outside their room unless an authorised officer permits the person to remove the face mask, and comply with any directions given by an authorised officer to avoid people congregating in a quarantine zone, and must not leave the quarantine zone in which the person's allocated room is located unless the person is escorted by an authorised officer, except in an emergency. Now, you are not able to share or hand over physical objects to residents who are not your family members. COVID-19 lives on services, so you must not give items, toys, food, activities, or play games like cards with people outside your family. Quarantine facility staff will remind you about wearing your mask, staying on your veranda, and physically distancing through information on your resident booklet by sending you SMS reminder texts and verbally in person if we see you are not following the direction. COVID-19 testing. All residents in quarantine, including all children, are tested 3 times during their stay on day 1, day 5 and day 12, and these tests are a nose and throat swab. If you do not undergo a test, you will be required to remain in quarantine a further 7 days at your own expense. Facilities. So quarantine facilities need to be a safe environment for all residents and staff, so the following are not permitted in either quarantine facility. So cooking equipment including microwaves, electric fryers, rice cookers, induction cookers, sandwich presses, toasters, etc. Alcohol, bags may be checked on arrival. Toys or recreational items such as swimming pools, plastic or inflatable, scooters, skateboards, bikes, balls and rollerblades. These will be stored until your exit. Visitors and care packages, personal goods or meal deliveries. Now, family rooms are not always available, so the Centre of National Resilience is primarily single-room accommodation with no internal connecting doors. There are 4 rooms to a shared veranda space with mattresses and or cots provided for small children, and all rooms are king single beds and have en-suites. Now, the Alice Springs Quarantine Facility can accommodate families in shared rooms based on room availability at the time. Wi-Fi is available at both facilities, however, speed and connectivity varies widely depending on demand and location. Amenities. Now, the following amenities relate to both facilities. Bottled water is not provided as tap water is safe for drinking in both facilities. Limited tea, coffee, sugar and milk. Disposable cups and hot water jug, free-to-air television, air conditioning. Now, toiletries are not provided, so please ensure you pack your own. Both facilities operate click and collect services for additional personal items you may require. Please remember to pack your phone chargers as these are not provided by the facilities. Meals. There are no cooking facilities in your room, and 3 meals a day are provided through each facility's catering team. Vegetarian, vegan, halal, medical dietary needs and food allergies to the best of ability are accommodated. When our regional location affects supplies, our team will work with you about meal options and alternatives. And individual meal requests may not be available in the first 24 hours of your stay, and once a special meal request has been made, it cannot be varied during your stay. Now, staff delivering your meals will be in personal protective equipment and will leave your meal outside your room, knocking to alert it is there. Now, no meal delivery or delivery services, including Uber Eats, Deliveroo, Menulog, Pizza, etc., are accepted at the gate, nor will facilities staff purchase food on your behalf. Facility staff. Please be mindful that our quarantine facilities are operated by dedicated staff from multiple Northern Territory government agencies and contractors. They are not responsible for your entry into quarantine, but they are working to make you stay as comfortable as possible whilst making sure strict infection control rules and CHO directions are followed. Now, it is expected that all interactions with staff remain courteous. Now, let's have a look at the current restrictions. Okay, so on this page we have all these here. So vaccine pass, mask use, face mask exemptions and mask mandates at airports. So vaccine pass or proof of vaccination. Now, you will need to show proof of vaccination when visiting certain venues. So the venues are bars, pubs and nightclubs, licensed to sell and consume liquor on premises, clubs, casinos, restaurants and cinemas, theatre, concert, music or dance hall. Now, the requirement does not impact takeaway food or beverages, food court, food truck, market stall or casual dining cafe that operates without a liquor license. Now, if you are not vaccinated, you cannot visit the above areas, which is all these areas here, and you can read more about proof of vaccinations and what is required by clicking on this link here. Mask use. You are no longer required to wear a face mask in most indoor settings in the Northern Territory, but wearing a mask remains recommended. Now, wearing masks reduces the risk of COVID-19 transmission. Face masks must be worn in the following high-risk settings, so hospitals and healthcare facilities, aged care facilities, disability residential facilities, correctional facilities, family violence, sobering up and homeless shelters, and then children under the age of 12 do not need to wear a mask. Face mask exemptions. Now, you are not required to wear a mask if you have a physical illness, mental health condition or disability that makes wearing a mask unsuitable. Now, only a police officer or an authorised officer can ask you to confirm the lawful reason you are not wearing a face mask. Now, if asked by a police officer, you must show them either a medical certificate or letter from the health practitioner or NDIS provider or a stat dec. You must also carry and produce evidence of your name and address to a police officer or authorised officer if requested, and people also have to wear a mask at airports and on planes as detailed below. Mask mandates at airports. Now, the CHO directions make it mandatory for face masks to be worn at all major Northern Territory airports and while on board an aircraft. Now, masks must be worn when inside the airport and when on the airfield. Children under the age of 12 and people with a specified medical condition are not required to wear a mask. And mask wearing is mandatory at the following Northern Territory airports. So at the Darwin International Airport, Alice Springs Airport, Connellan Airport, Ayers Rock, Yulara, Gove Airport, Groot, Island. Now, a person is not required to wear a mask during an emergency or while doing any of the following. So consuming food or beverage, communicating with a person who is hearing impaired, wearing an oxygen mask. So it is the responsibility of individuals to make sure they have a mask to wear when at major Northern Territory airports and while on board an aircraft. Historical exposure sites, so if you click on this link here, it will give you more information. And as you can see here, this part of the website was updated on the 23rd of March 2022. Now let's look at Repatriated Australians. There are changes to quarantine requirements. So from the 1st of March, quarantine requirements for repatriated Australians arriving on Commonwealth facilitated flights will change. So those arrivals who are fully vaccinated with a vaccine approved by ATIGI for entry into Australia will no longer be required to quarantine. Now, for the unvaccinated repatriated Australians, you will be required to undertake 7 days of mandatory supervised quarantine under the Northern Territory Public and Environmental Health Act of 2011, and the mandatory quarantine must be taken at the Centre of National Resilience at Howard Springs. Now, all returning vaccinated and unvaccinated Australians are able to travel to Darwin on Commonwealth facilitated flights. Now, let's have a quick look at what's on this page. So you can see here that you can calculate your quarantine period. There's pre-arrival info, arrival info, info for children. Then there's the fees, the quarantine fees. And if you're an Australian resident on low income, and then there's the flexible payment options information. And as you can see here, this page was last updated on the 3rd of March 2022. That is the latest travel advice updates for those travelling into the Northern Territory from overseas. Hope you found that helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe. All the best. Take care. Safe travels. It's Helen Hortai, founder of Form Help, signing out.